this is really the place where I'm sure many of you have gotten if you're struggling with assessment in this new age of discourse. I think that I also, being a teacher educator who teaches about assessment makes, of course, all of this very meta for me. But what I recognize and what I teach when we talk about assessment is the sort of slipperiness of validity in assessment. We think about what I use from from the Understanding by Design framework to generally talk about assessment validity from Wiggins and Gatai is the two-question validity test. And that is, could a student have done this assignment and done well, but still not really understand the concepts? And then on the flip side of that spectrum, could the student have done this assignment and done poorly, but still have understood these concepts quite well? And so your validity falls into that sort of spectrum, and there's no perfectly valid assessment, as we know and as we can recognize. And so when I think about designing appropriate assessments in the age of AI, I want to lean into process. And I also want to think about validity and how I'm using the data, which is something I really focus on with my students when I assess. And typically for me, I'm using the data for much more than grading. I'm using it to tell me how I keep teaching this topic, how I help students continue to dig in, what I need to reteach, what they haven't gotten yet. And for me, really, grading is a secondary use of that assessment data that I tend to negotiate with students because my belief is like, I want to know that you're learning and I want to give you evidence that you're learning and help you see evidence that you're learning. And so we negotiate different ways that they can present that evidence to me in sort of like a live discussion of what assessment means and what validity means given their own understandings. So what I did in this assignment is I used an element of them creating and designing a lesson plan, and I invited them to lean into GenAI, which many of them were very resistant to do, and we had to sort of had that conversation. And I thought with Dr. Basir and Dr. Renee sort of deeply about if we're no longer assessing the product, the lesson plan, the template we have them fill out, if essentially a Gen AI can very quickly and very accurately with relative efficiency, and it's getting more and more efficient and more detailed and more sophisticated, all of these tools around lesson planning, as we've been having these conversations over the last 18 months. But I want to think about what am I trying to see that they understand? And for me, that's really, I want to see if they understand this concept of how these frameworks work, how they frame learning and lesson planning, how they create an arc of acquisition, meaning making, and transfer across that arc. And then also how they're serving diverse learners, how they're using inclusion. And so my question is really sort of shifted to be about how do they interrogate lessons that are already created by AI and reflect on what's been created to sort of see if their understanding is clear. So in order to do that, I create a template that sort of guides them through the lesson plan process. I invite them to use AI. We do it a little bit together in the beginning. And after they draft a lesson plan and turn in that product, they also have to complete a survey where they reflect on the product that's been created. And I use two key ways to have them do this. And I need to move. There we go. Now let me zoom in here. I use both quantitative and qualitative data. And so I use a yes, no, maybe structure. And so I invite them to look at what the lesson plan does. You can see over here a few of the questions. And in this case, it's about stage 1, the goals and objectives. Does it do this? And I'm asking a yes, no, maybe for a conceptual grasp because I'm comparing that to the product. So I can see if they've accurately identified that yes, it does, no, it doesn't. And a maybe simply tells me they don't understand. They're not clear on their ability to judge this. And so then if we look at a graph of the yes, no, maybes across the assessment, I thought what was really interesting is that the fewest maybes were in stage 1, which I had taught and taught deeply when I had them do this. And we had only just begun to touch on stage 2, but assessment is the sort of the most difficult thing to align. And so there are a lot of no's that they didn't think that the assessment really did what it was supposed to do. And so they'd gotten a little lesson on assessment, but they had not yet gotten any lessons on instructional design. And so you see the maybes here are gray, that there were far more maybes in the area of instructional design, that they weren't quite sure if they were answering that question accurately, if they could really judge that on their own knowledge. And so what excited me about this data is it really reflected in real time what was going on in our learning process. And it sort of confirmed for me that yes, they should have the fewest maybes about stage 1, and then some about stage 2, and as well as GenAI doesn't do as well of a job aligning assessment to goals. And so they had lots of no's here, which is my agreement when I review what GenAI does with assessment. And then finally, the most uncertainty around instructional design of the learning experiences, the sort of moves in front of students, if you will, that they had the least amount of confidence around, because we'd learned that the least amount. And then some of at the end of each section, you can sort of see here, and I can blow it up a little more. Can zoom in. At the end of each stage of the framework, I invite them to reflect specifically on this stage as part of their process. Like, what do they think they need to do? What's going on here? And so I have not only this sort of like quantitative, 1, 2, 3, yes, no, maybe data, but I also have some qualitative data that goes with that to help me determine levels of understanding and a little bit more nuance around understanding. So here are a few of those quotes from the first data session. So I had one person say, this is about assessment, maybe this is aligned, but I didn't check if the assessment measures it, right? And so what I got from this is they understood that they have to really deeply understand the assessment and check it against the goal in order to know if that alignment, if that validity is happening. And then of course I'm like, why didn't you check it? Is my next question, but at least I got that. So they're still students, they're still learning. And then another one, I think AI helped me make objectives clear, but I'm not sure if it's inclusive. So this is like a more nuanced thing, so that it helped me with clarity, but I'm still not confident that this is the right way I'm supposed to be doing this and how I make objectives inclusive for multiple kinds of learners. And so you can see the benefits sort of there across the 2 different kinds of data points that I used with this assessment. And then let's move on to just talk a little bit about what this means sort of for me and the work that I'm doing and this type of assessment for students. So using the AI as sort of this mirror of not just creating the product, but reflecting on what the product is and how well it's done really helps not only their design quality, but helps them think about the framework. And really, as a teacher going to be doing this on their own without any coaching in the future, I want them to deeply understand the framework more than I want them to create perfect lesson plans. And so knowing whether or not they understand that framework and using this process to have them dig into that design experience is really modeling on the kind of learning experience I'm wanting them to have. And then again, the reflection is the data. The reflection creates the validity in this assessment for me. Do they know it? Are they confident about it? And then alongside the product, I can see if their perceptions are accurate. I can look at that lesson plan as I'm looking at their reflection data and see, oh, they think this is accurate, but it's not. So they don't understand validity and assessment. They don't understand SMART goals yet. If they think that these are SMART goals, they are not, if that makes sense. And then finally, critical literacy. Students are not just using AI to produce one product and turn it in. They're understanding and jumping into an iterative experience with Gen AI tools that, if we think of that term, the human in the loop, that students have really a deep grasp of. And I model this how we start to do it in class, how we do it together when we look at peer work, how we go back to it, and then continuing to examine different ways that it exposes bias when it does these processes, and ways for us to continue to be cautious even as we reap the benefits of more efficient lesson planning and curricular design experience, right? And then just a focus that I'm comparing their perception of how well AI did this work with the product that was created. And now this allows me to use that data to tell me what I still need to teach, what they need to understand better, and where we need to go from here, which is my use, my targeted use, as I said when I began, of how I use this assessment data. Yeah. I can stop sharing.